Danny Truth Magnified.
Now, when NASA sent the Voyager probe to Saturn in 1981, they said they came across this weird looking formation on the northern region of Saturn. And it basically looked like a hexagon circling in the middle of what they thought to be like a storm on Saturn's surface. And when they sent the Cassini probe in 2006, they got a really good look at this thing. And it was confirmed for sure that this was a perfect hexagonal shape, smack dab in the middle of this swirling whirlwind. And it never seemed to stop, like it was continually going on this swirling motion nonstop. And as they moved in closer, they realized not just how wide this thing was, because they estimated it to be about 18,000 miles wide. But they also found that this thing wasn't just sitting on the surface of Saturn, but it's also stretching out into the clouds of Saturn. And this hexagonal shape is basically like a tower that they estimate to be about 190 miles high. And this is when NASA officially started referring to this thing as a vortex. And here's where it gets real crazy. The southern hemisphere of Saturn also has a vortex. And there's all these different theories about what this vortex is and how it formed and everything, but there's no official explanation as to what it is or why it exists at all. But what's interesting is that in 2002, the Cassini probe started detecting these radio emissions coming from Saturn. And these radio waves are constantly changing, but they continuously emit from the planet Saturn. And this has led to some theories that these radio waves are directly connected to these vortexes on the northern and southern hemispheres of the planet. And of course, we know NASA is full of you know what, but everything needs to be taken into consideration. Now, if you rewind for a bit and you go back and you look at the three major ancient texts, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, you're going to find Saturn constantly being placed in this high level of importance. You're going to hear the Sabbath mentioned a lot and how the Sabbath should be revered. Now, remember, for Orthodox Jews, the Sabbath is Saturday. And then the word Saturday literally means the day of Saturn, because based off of the history that they give us, when the Greeks set up the 7 days of the week, they named Saturday after the god Saturn. So Saturday is the day of the god Saturn, and the Sabbath day is Saturday. And then if we go back and look at these ancient texts, we can look at the Bible where it says, "Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily, my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. Ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people." In this verse alone, you can see how serious the Sabbath is to the Lord in the Bible. So much so that anybody that doesn't keep the Sabbath is commanded by the Lord to be put to death. And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. So right here, the Bible is giving you a clear connection, and a strong one, between God and the Sabbath. I mean, Lord of the Sabbath. That's pretty clear cut. "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feast of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest. And holy convocation, ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings." So it's saying that the Sabbath is on the seventh day. And according to the international standard that pretty much everybody goes by except the United States, Canada, and Australia, Sunday is considered the seventh day of the week. But if you go back far enough, you can see how the days of the week have been flipped around, and has led to all this confusion. And this is why you have Christians who worship on Sunday, while you have people who practice Orthodox Judaism, Seventh Adventists, etc., that still honor the Sabbath day as Saturday. There's even confusion amongst Muslims where the day of prayer for the Muslims is Friday. But when you actually read the Quran, the original Sabbath day, or the Sabt, is Saturday. The word for Sabbath in Arabic, Sabt, translates to the word Saturday. And it's made a point throughout the Quran that there's something extremely important about the Sabbath. The Sabbath was appointed only for those who differed concerning it. And lo, thy Lord will judge between them on the day of resurrection concerning that wherein they used to differ. And we caused the mount to tower above them at the taking of their covenant, and we bade them enter the gate prostrate, transgress not the Sabbath, and we took from them a firm covenant. And ye know of those of you who broke the Sabbath, how we said unto them, be ye apes, despised and hated. And we made it an example to their own and to succeeding generations, and an admonition to the God-fearing. So again, just like the Bible, you can see just how serious the Sabbath is made out to be in the Quran. Now, in Hinduism, they don't necessarily have one specific holy day, but each day of the week is dedicated to a particular Hindu god. And Saturday is dedicated to the god Shani. And the word Shani in Sanskrit actually translates to the word Saturn. So the god Shani is directly related to the planet Saturn. In Hindu mythology, Shani is looked at as the god of justice, and he brings down judgment on everybody, including all the other Hindu gods. So because of this, in Hinduism, the planet Saturn is considered the most powerful planet. Now, the story goes that Shani's father is actually the sun, and that he was born so close to the sun that when he was born, he came out of the womb completely black. And if you look at any images of Shani, you're going to see that he's this completely black humanoid. And there's multiple temples all over India dedicated to Shani, aka Saturn. There's at least 10 different shrines, all in different cities, all over India. And usually these statues of Shani are massive. He's usually depicted as like being 20 to 23 feet tall. And people show up in large crowds and perform rituals at these temples. And they say most of these temples stretch back hundreds of years. I think the most recent one is the Shani Dham temple, but most of them stretch back hundreds of years. The Shani Singapore temple goes back at least 400 years. And I don't think I really need to explain. You can see how Shani is depicted. And you got the whole mythology there of his father being the sun. So him basically being a child of the sun and the very first child of the sun. There's so much there. But in Greek mythology, Saturn is a Titan, one of the original gods birthed out of that primordial chaos during the early stages of the universe. And as one of the Titans, the god Saturn goes by the name Kronos. And Kronos rules over all the other gods as king of the Titans. And he pretty much ruled over the entire universe in what they called the Golden Age. He was the god of agriculture, and he was also looked at as the god of time. He controlled time, and because of that, pretty much controlled the fate of every living thing. And this is where we get the idea of Father Time from Kronos. This is also where we get the Grim Reaper, or the collector of souls. And this is why when you see depictions of the Grim Reaper, he's always carrying around that scythe, just like Kronos. Now, in the Greek mythology, Kronos eventually has children. His children become the Olympians. And, it's pretty much set in stone that one day his children will take over his throne. But Kronos isn't willing to give up his throne, so much so that he actually eats his own children in order to protect his throne. And this leads to the war between the Titans and the Olympians. And Kronos is eventually defeated by his son, Zeus. This is how Zeus becomes king of the gods in Greek mythology. Despite there being so many Greek gods, and there's a lot, at least 600 plus, when you look back at that ancient Greco-Roman time period, it looks like there was no god that was worshipped more than Saturn. They had an entire festival dedicated to this god that lasted 6 days called Saturnalia. And during this festival, they would drink and party, pretty much what the Greeks and the Romans did, but they would do this in the name of Saturn. They would give each other gifts, and they would decorate evergreen trees with ornaments of the moon, the sun, the stars. And they would take the branches of the evergreen tree and make wreaths that they would hang on the doors of the houses and the temples. This has kind of led to people thinking that Christmas actually comes directly from Saturnalia, because they did all of this between December 17th and December 23rd. And pretty much every single Greco-Roman citizen was involved in this Saturnalia festival, even the slaves. And they say it was the one time of the year when the slaves weren't treated like slaves, and they were allowed to freely participate in this event. Now, there might be a little twist to that, because every single Saturnalia would begin with a human sacrifice to the god Saturn. They actually had this huge structure built that they called the Temple of Saturn. You can still go to Italy today and they say it's still standing in the same spot that it was thousands of years ago. And right there at the base, right between the two main pillars, is where they say that they used to have this huge wooden statue of Saturn. And this is where they would kick off this whole Saturnalia festival by dedicating a human sacrifice to the god Saturn right there in that exact spot. And who knows what all else was going on. You got to remember, this history was written by the elite, the people that were empowered during that time. So who knows what isn't being told and whatnot. But the Greco-Romans believed in something called the Golden Age. And this was a time in the past when the god Saturn ruled over the entire world. And they believed that during this time that this god literally walked the earth. And the Greco-Romans credited Saturn with teaching them everything they knew, basically. But the Greco-Romans believed that this god Saturn was responsible for putting them in the position that they were in. And they pretty much dedicated themselves to this god. And you definitely have to question, if this wasn't a being that they really saw and that they really knew existed, then why go through all this effort to appease this god to the point where you're literally sending up human sacrifices? Well, there is a theory that Saturn wasn't always a planet, that during ancient times, our solar system had a different alignment, and that Saturn was actually our sun, which would have put Saturn a lot closer to the earth than it is today. And it makes sense when you think about when this Saturnalia festival was held, right around the winter solstice, right around that time when it's thought that the sun is basically re-energizing and going through this rebirth. And a sun is a powerful object. I mean, it sustains life in so many ways. And Saturn is one of only two planets in our solar system, along with Jupiter, that's considered a gas giant, because the planet is composed of mostly hydrogen and helium, the two main elements that you find inside of a star. Actually, the composition is so close to a star that sometimes they call these planets failed stars. And Saturn sometimes is considered a failed star. But if Saturn was closer to the Earth and was functioning as a sun at one point in time, then you got to get into the question of, how did it go from a sun to a planet? How did that whole planetary alignment shift into what we have today? And then you still have to question, what is going on with Saturn right now? With what NASA has given us, with all these strange things happening with this vortex, and Saturn seeming to have this massive influence over the planet at one point in time. And even still today, it's just a lot less in your face. Every single Muslim, as long as they're physically able, is required to participate in something called the Hajj. And the Hajj is basically this pilgrimage that they have to make to this area in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, called the Kaaba. And they call this area the House of Allah. Now, Muslims believe that this area in Mecca was the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. And they believe that this is where he had his first revelation and dedicated this area to the one true God. But then they also say that the history of the Kaaba goes all the way back to the days of Abraham, nearly 2,000 years ago. And ultimately, they give credit to Abraham as being the one who actually built the Kaaba. And the Kaaba itself is this black stone sitting in the middle of this structure. And the word Kaaba in Arabic actually literally translates to the word cube. And they go through all these rituals around this area to complete the Hajj. But everything begins at the Kaaba and everything ends at the Kaaba. And every single year you have millions of Muslims who come together on this one day to complete this pilgrimage. And during the first part of the Hajj, they have to walk counterclockwise around this cube 7 times. And at the end of all this, they travel back to the Kaaba in Mecca, and they circle around the Kaaba cube one last time to close out the Hajj. Now, like I said, millions of Muslims come down to Mecca to participate in this. When you really take a look at this walk around the Kaaba and you look at it above ground in an overhead view, this is where things get really weird, because it looks almost identical to this vortex on the northern and southern hemispheres of Saturn. I mean, you could post them up side by side and the resemblance is eerie. Even the direction that the vortex is going in that counterclockwise motion you're getting that same exact counterclockwise motion around the Kaaba. It literally looks like you have millions of people down in Mecca reenacting the activity of this vortex on Saturn. I mean, if it's just a coincidence, it's a big one. Remember, they say they got the first shot of that hexagon on Saturn in 1981. And it wasn't until 2006 that they realized that it was even rotating. This is what they say. And then you have the Hajj, which has been going on way before that. You got Muslims claiming it goes all the way back to the days of Abraham. But we definitely know they were practicing this well before 1981. So the time just isn't lining up. And then you have the Kaaba itself, you know, the actual cube that everybody walks around. Remember, the word Kaaba literally means cube in Arabic. Well, we have a cube in the middle of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And then we have this hexagon on Saturn. And normally a hexagon is going to look like what we see on Saturn. But when you get into geometry, a hexagon can actually be any shape with 6 sides that are equal in measurement. And because of this, a cube can actually be looked at as the 3-dimensional form of a hexagon when it's converted from its normal 2-dimensional flat shape. Because with a cube, you have a shape with 6 sides and all 6 sides are equal in measurement. So literally a cube is just a hexagon in its 3rd-dimensional form. And again, you got millions of people going around this Kaaba or cube in the exact same motion as this hexagonal vortex on Saturn. In order to be considered orthodox or somebody that's considered to be practicing true Judaism, you're required to wear this thing called the Tefillin. And the Tefillin is this cube-shaped black box that they wear on their arm and on their head. They insert verses from the Torah inside this black box, and then they're required to wrap it around their arm exactly 7 times. And then the second part of the Tefillin is placed on top of the head. They say that placing the Tefillin on the arm is supposed to symbolize committing your heart to God, because the arm is the closest thing to the heart. And placing it on the head symbolizes complete commitment of the mind. And it's actually a part of the Judaic law that the Tefillin has to be in the form of a cube. Otherwise, it's not considered a true Tefillin. And they say that the practice of wearing this Tefillin goes all the way back to the days of Moses. They believe it was a direct commandment from God after he brought the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt. And they believe that in ancient times, all the followers of the Judaic God wore a Tefillin every single day, 24 hours a day, to symbolize their complete commitment to this God. Now you fast forward to today and they kind of toned it down to where now they're required to put the Tefillin on every morning during their morning prayer, but they're still required to wear the Tefillin every single day. That looks quite a lot like the Kaaba cube that Muslims walk around during the Hajj. But then you have to think about the fact that they have to wrap the tassels around their arms 7 times, just like Muslims have to make that rotation around the Kaaba 7 times. And then you got both the Bible and the Quran really pushing the Sabbath, even with the Christian cross or the crucifix. When you look at that traditional form of the cross that we're so accustomed to seeing, if you take that cross laid out flat in 2D and you begin to fold it, at the end, you're going to end up with a cube, because a cross can be perfectly divided into 6 sides. And when you fold those 6 sides into a 3-dimensional form, you get a cube. And so looking at the reverse side of that, a cube, when it's unfolded and broken down to a 2D form, becomes a cross. So a cross is another form of a cube. And then what's wild is that if you look at the symbol that's used to represent Saturn in astrology, you can see it. You have the cross with the scythe coming out of it. And in astrology, they say that the cross actually represents everything that's made up of matter, everything that's physical. That cross represents in astrology. And then you got the scythe coming out of the cross. And remember, that scythe goes back to Kronos, or the Greek god Saturn. So it's like it's alluding to a connection between the physical world and the god Saturn. Even the Star of David that you see on the flag of Israel, and that's considered like one of the most important symbols of Judaism, is a hexagram. And a hexagram is a 6-pointed star that is literally just the outline of a hexagon. Those 6 points on the hexagram perfectly align to give you a hexagon. And then we know a hexagon is going to take you right back to a cube. And you can see this same shape of a hexagram in the symbol for the atom. And you know the atom is the most basic element that makes up this physical reality. Everything is made up of atoms. So just like the cross in astrology, the hexagram is being used to represent this physical reality, this material world, everything on a physical level. A lot of people over the years have pointed out what seems like all of this Saturn symbolism in mainstream media. For years, people have been pointing this stuff out. And when you look at a lot of these TV shows, movies, even just the commercials, there does seem to be this strong influence pointing back to Saturn. There's a lot of little hints that seem to point in that direction, especially when it comes to a lot of the movies. It seems like that's where it's the strongest. Once you have an idea of like all the symbolism that can be connected back to Saturn, it's crazy how this stuff just starts to like jump out at you. You have so many major companies who seem to have their logos, sometimes even the name of the products, the slogans that they're using to sell the products, so many things that seem to connect. And sometimes it seems really subtle. Sometimes it seems like it's being put right in front of your face. But you can see bits and pieces of this symbolism all throughout mainstream media. But when you combine a lot of this stuff all together, it all seems to connect. And it's like we're getting it from all sides, so many different forms of media. And it almost seems like years ago, it was a lot more in your face. The symbolism was a lot less subtle and it was kind of just out there. And it's just another one of those things that makes you think all this stuff is connected in some way. Another odd thing to point out are these black cubes that you can find spread out throughout different parts of the world. You have these giant black cubes that are placed in all these different spots all over, from Australia to Europe, all the way to California. And they're all supposed to have been created by different people, independent artists, people who are not connected to each other at all. But somehow they all got inspired to sculpt these giant black cubes. And again, you can find these things all over the place. And when you find them, they're usually going to be in these really odd locations, in the middle of a business district, randomly sitting in a suburban neighborhood, on the roof of a kids museum, just in these really awkward spots. And they're always large and they're always black. And it's crazy. You have people doing everyday normal things in these normal surroundings, these normal settings. And then right in the middle of all of that, you have one of these cubes completely out of place. And you can really get a feel of just how huge these things are when you see actual people walking next to these things. You can really get a sense of the scale. These things make an average human being look like an ant. They're massive. And then to transport them to these specific spots, it just seems very purpose driven. And the one in New York City is the one that really caught my eye. This one was made by another independent artist, but it was sculpted all the way back in 1966. And then the following year, it was given as a gift to the city of New York by an anonymous donor, just a random donation from an unknown person. This is the actual story behind this thing. And this was actually the very first permanent sculpture in New York City. So it was the very first sculpture to actually have a part of it built into the ground in New York City. Like I said, it's been around since 1967. And as you can guess, over the years, it's gotten a little banged up here and there. And the city has put over $180,000 in renovations into this thing. And when it was represented to the public in 2016, it was this huge deal. They had this big presentation just for them reinstalling it into the ground. And all of the city officials came together and basically celebrated the renovation and return of this sculpture. One, not only is it tilted to the side at the perfect angle to form a hexagon, this thing was constructed to where it's able to spin on its axis. And this is one of the big attractions for a lot of the people who come and visit this part of New York, is to come together as a group and spin this black cube around. And it does usually take more than one person to spin this thing because of just how heavy it is. Now remember, this cube is tilted at the perfect angle to form a hexagon. So you have this cube / hexagon rotating around in a circle on its axis, really similar to the hexagon rotating on Saturn's North Pole. And just like the Kaaba, the dates don't line up. This cube was sculpted in 1966. And again, from what we're being told, there was no knowledge of that hexagon spinning on Saturn until 2006. But yeah, this rotating hexagonal black cube has been sitting in the middle of New York for a long time. And the craziest part is you have little miniature versions of this same cube in other locations outside of New York. There's one in Southampton, Miami, Michigan, Ohio, Connecticut. You've got little miniature versions of this thing scattered across the country with the same exact design, a spinning black cube tilted perfectly to form a hexagon. Not too far from that spinning black cube is the United Nations headquarters, and it's open to the public. You're able to freely tour this building as long as you're over the age of 25. And inside the United Nations headquarters, they have a meditation room, and it's almost a completely empty room outside of some benches where you can sit, an abstract painting on the wall in the back of the room, and a black rectangular structure dead center in the middle of the room. And there's a light placed directly above the sculpture. And they say it's supposed to symbolize the light of the sun beaming down and giving life to everything on earth. But it's interesting because remember, in Hinduism, the god Shani is born directly under his father, the sun. And that's what ends up giving him that black hue. But they say that they specifically designed the room as an altar to the unknown god that's worshipped by many names, because obviously the United Nations caters to every nation. Now, clearly this sculpture is carved in the shape of a rectangle. A rectangle in its third dimensional form is considered a cuboid because it has those 6 symmetrical sides, just like a cube, and all the angles in a cuboid are right angles. And so because of this, these shapes are placed into the same category as a cube. But once again, we have yet another black cubical object in what seems like another odd location. And this one's being used to symbolize all world religions. You can see a form of that black cube symbolism with the graduation cap, because that graduation cap is usually black and it has that cube-like shape to it. So when you wear a graduation cap, it's like you're literally wearing a black cube on the top of your head. And when you look into the history of it, it goes all the way back to the Roman Catholic Church and something that they have been wearing for centuries called the Canterbury cap. And literally, when you look at it, it's a square cap, almost identical to the graduation cap. But when you look at it, you can clearly see the roots of the graduation cap. And what's interesting to me is that the technical name for the graduation cap is the mortarboard. And the only other time you see that word mortarboard is when you're dealing with actual masons, people that build structures. They use a mortarboard to transfer the cement onto the bricks. And it is this square shaped board, just like the top of the graduation cap. But what a coincidence that they would use Mason terminology to describe this black cube shaped cap that you basically earn by moving up the ranks of society or the system, a system set up by people that seem to have this really strong connection to Saturn. So who or what is Saturn? Well, if you notice, there's a strong similarity between the word Saturn and the word Satan. And even though there's no concrete proof that the word Satan comes from the word Saturn, when you look back at how we originally got that popular depiction of Satan with the horns and the tail, that whole depiction of Satan was taken directly from the Greek god Pan. And Pan was a hybrid. He was 1/2 human and 1/2 goat. And you can see how he has the upper body of a human outside of the horns and the ears, and the lower body of a goat with the hindquarters, the tail, and everything. And Pan was considered the god of the wild. So like untamed, undomesticated nature, and the god of lustful sex. There's a lot of depictions of Pan that I can't even show here because it might get this video taken down. But you'll usually see these really sexualized depictions of Pan. And this is actually where we get the term pansexual. You know, somebody that's open to like all different types of sex with anybody and anything. That comes from the god Pan. And one of the really weird things about Pan is that he doesn't have an actual origin story. It's like he just kind of came out of nowhere. Some people say he was the son of Zeus, and then some people say he was the adopted brother of all the rest of the Olympians. Some people say that he's older than all of the Olympians. Either way, there's no true origin of Pan, but eventually the Roman Catholic Church took those characteristics of Pan and gave them to Satan. And this is where we got that half man, half goat depiction of Satan, which actually in some cases would be a full goat. Now, going back into astrology, if you look at the symbol for Saturn in the zodiac, it's the sea goat, which is 1 part goat and 1 part fish. And the explanation that they give for why they chose the goat is because when you look at that constellation, the outline of the stars forms something that looks similar to a goat's horn. And you can definitely see that outline in the pattern of the stars of this constellation. But what makes it seem like that goat horn was meant to represent something else is because of the way that Saturn is depicted in the tarot. Because literally Saturn is represented by the devil in the tarot. And if you look at it, you'll notice that you have the devil sitting on top of a black cube. And then you have 2 human beings, a male and a female, chained to that black cube, which is causing them to take on the features of the devil. So a human being operating completely from their lower nature, completely from their animalistic basic instincts. And remember, that's exactly what that god Pan is about, that untamed animalistic nature, giving fully into your lower nature and basically giving fully into the material world without any type of self-discipline or higher thought, which all come from the mind. So again, matter over mind. And remember that symbol for Saturn in astrology with the cross representing matter and the physical world, and then Saturn's scythe being attached to that cross. Well, you're basically getting the same thing here with human beings being chained to that black cube of the devil. Just right here, you have the devil replacing Saturn. So whoever made this a thing in planetary astrology and in tarot with the goat and the devil leading back to Saturn, they were really trying to push this point home about the connection between Saturn and Satan. Now, eventually from this goat-like depiction of Satan, we would get the Baphomet, that image used by the Church of Satan and other people who deal in different forms of Satanism. And there's a history of this thing that goes all the way back to the Crusades, that medieval time period when you had the Knights Templar attempting to convert different nations over to Catholicism and Christianity. Well, what's crazy is that as a part of that history, the Knights Templar were actually accused of worshiping the Baphomet. Either way, the history of the accusations are there. But despite all that history, there was no known depictions of the Baphomet until 1856, when this writer, Eliphas Levi, wrote a book called The Dogma and Rituals of High Magic. And in that book, we got the first known image of the Baphomet, the same image that we're familiar with today, the half man, half goat, half male, half female Baphomet. But what's interesting is how he referred to the Baphomet in the book, because if you look at it, he referred to the Baphomet as the Sabbatic goat. And that word Sabbatic is used to refer to something that's connected to the Sabbath. And remember, the Sabbath is dealing with Saturday, which ultimately takes you back to Saturn. Now, the occult explanation for the Baphomet is that it's supposed to symbolize this perfect balance between two complete opposites. So like good and evil, masculine and feminine, light and dark, negative and positive, those opposite energies that you find inside human beings. And when you master those two polar opposites and you're able to bring them together in a perfect balance, this is what leads a person to becoming enlightened or illuminated, which is why you see the torch sprouting out of the top of the head. Then you have the wings and the two intertwined snakes, which was taken from the Greek god Hermes, because the symbol for Hermes is the caduceus, the rod with the two wings and the two intertwined snakes. And you see this symbol used in the medical field a lot, but it actually goes back to this Greek god. And in mythology, Hermes was looked at basically like a messenger god. He was like a middleman between the gods and mortals, and he would convey messages back and forth between the different realms. So it's being used here as a way of saying that the symbol of the Baphomet contains some type of divine knowledge. Now, the reason for the goat symbology or the Pan symbology is to symbolize the belief of a need for evil, that evil is actually a necessary component of existence, that basically we need evil to understand good, because if you didn't have evil, you'd have nothing to compare good to. So the idea is that evil is a necessary component in order for us to understand reality in full detail. Just like you need a negative and a positive charge to create an energetic spark in something. It's pretty much that same concept, that you need both the negative and the positive in order to experience full existence. And clearly with that image of Pan, the focus with the Baphomet is on bringing in that lower energy, that negative animalistic energy into this reality. Now, there's a statue of George Washington, one of the founding fathers, that was created in 1840. And it used to sit right in the middle of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. And originally it was supposed to stay in the Capitol. But there was so much controversy over this statue, mainly because it depicted George Washington without a shirt, which was a huge issue during that time, that in 1908, it got moved indoors, first to the Smithsonian Museum. Now it's in the National Museum of American History. But when you really look at this sculpture, it looks a lot like one of the founding fathers, George Washington, sculpted in the same exact pose as the Baphomet. You put them up side by side and they're nearly identical. They're both seated with that same posture, and the hand gestures are really similar. Not to mention that you have George Washington depicted with his shirt off, which again, when that statue was presented to the public in 1840, That was one of the big issues that people had with it. Why is the president of the United States half naked on this statue? Well, if you compare him to the Baphomet, which is also shirtless, and then them both having nothing but that cloth covering them up, it seems like there might be a connection. And remember, again, this statue of George Washington was built in 1840, and we didn't get that first official depiction of the Baphomet until 1856. So then you got to ask, which came first, the sculpture of George Washington or the Baphomet? Either way, there's clearly a strong similarity between these two images. Now, you got to keep in mind that George Washington was a well-known Freemason. And eventually down the line, we got this French writer named Leo Taxil, who started up this huge campaign against the Freemasons. And one of his main claims was that the Freemasons were worshiping the devil in the lodges, and that they were specifically worshiping the Baphomet. And this lasted all the way from the early 1890s all the way to 1897. And it was extremely controversial. He was getting a lot of backlash from Freemasons until one day, all of a sudden in 1897, he comes out and says that it was all a hoax, that he pretty much lied about everything, and that it was some sort of like social experiment to see how many Catholics he could get to believe this story, because apparently he was extremely anti-Catholic, and eventually this whole thing would go on to be known as the Taxil hoax. Now, if that's not crazy enough, around this same time period, you had this English occultist named Aleister Crowley start this organization called the Order of the Temple of the East. And from this organization, he ended up forming his own religion called Thelema. And this man, Aleister Crowley, went on to be known as the wickedest man in the world. He actually went out of his way to dive into all types of dark and evil stuff. And he actually named himself the Great Beast 666. And eventually he went on to refer to himself as the Baphomet. And his main motto in all of his teachings was do what thou wilt. So basically having no boundaries, no discipline, no self-control, pretty much embodying those characteristics of the god Pan. He was actually kicked out of Italy and banned by the Italian government because of some of the sick stuff that he was rumored to be doing in this house in France that he had turned into a cult. And this eventually led to him becoming one of the most widely known occultists in the world. Now, the symbol for this religion that he created, Thelema, is actually a unique form of a hexagram. Now, with a regular hexagram, you have two triangles that overlap each other to create that hexagram. But a unicursal hexagram is a hexagram that's created in one continuous motion, one continuous line. So geometrically, it could actually be seen as like the perfect form of the hexagram. But it's crazy because this unicursal hexagram is actually extremely similar to another symbol in the practice of magic called the sigil of Saturn, or the seal of Saturn. I mean, they look nearly identical when you put them side by side. And this seal is supposed to be created from what they call the magic square of Saturn. And it's every number from 1 through 9 aligned in perfect horizontal and diagonal rows to form a square by tracing out each one of these numbers in this square. And from that outline, you get the seal of Saturn, or the sigil of Saturn. Now, in magic, the planet Saturn is associated with time, containment, death, and stagnation. So a lot of negative energy. Now, remember, time is taking us back to Kronos because he was considered the god of time. Remember, Father Time, counting down and only giving you so much time. And then you have death, which takes you back to the Grim Reaper, carrying around that scythe and waiting for your time to run out. And again, the Grim Reaper is directly connected to Kronos, or Saturn. And then you have containment and stagnation. And with those two, just think about the devil and human beings being chained to that black cube of the devil. And again, the devil points you right back to Saturn. And then all of this is contained in this square or cube. And it seems like we have the quote unquote wickedest man in the world. This guy calling himself the Beast and the Baphomet, doing all this low energy, low vibrational stuff, creating an entire religion centered around tapping into the energies of Saturn. Now, there's a lot of debate out there about whether or not Aleister Crowley was a Freemason. And even though there's nothing official on record to prove that he was, there are a couple of images of him dressed in the Freemasonic attire. So it brings in the question, was he connected to the Freemasons? And what's crazy is that if you take the official symbol for Freemasonry with the compass overlapping the ruler, and you compare that symbol to the unicursal hexagram, they look really similar. The compass is laid over the ruler at the perfect angle to give you those same 6 points that you see on the universal hexagram. You've got the 2 adjacent points to the left and the right, and then you've got those 2 triangular points at the top and the bottom, exactly like that universal hexagram. It's giving you the same angles, the same points. And if you put the symbol for Freemasonry side by side with the sigil of Saturn, again, there is a similarity because, of course, you've got a lot of those same angles that you see in the universal hexagram in the sigil of Saturn. Now, if we rewind back a little bit to the mid 1800s, we end up running into this guy named Albert Pike, probably one of the most influential Freemasons in history. He was a high ranking 33rd degree Mason, and he was basically responsible for developing the framework of that organization. This guy was a really influential Freemason, so much so that after he passed away in 1891, about a half a century later, they built a museum in his honor in the Masonic Temple in Washington, D.C., and then they moved his remains into that temple. In 1901, they built a memorial statue in his honor and placed it in the middle of the Judiciary Square in Washington, D.C. Now, despite all the protests and calls for action to get this statue taken down, the federal government has refused to do anything. And it's crazy because Albert Pike is literally the only Confederate military officer with an outdoor statue in Washington, D.C. So it just kind of shows you just how powerful this man's influence was. Now, in 1871, he wrote a book called Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And he went into a lot of stuff in the book. But when you read it and you get to page 5 of the book, he starts talking about the ashlars. And an ashlar is a square stone that's used in masonry, that's used to finish off the walls of brick and mortar structures. And right here, he compares the ashlars to actual people. It says, "You will hear shortly of the rough ashlar and the perfect ashlar as part of the jewels of the lodge. The rough ashlar is said to be a stone as taken from the quarry in its rude and natural state. The perfect ashlar is said to be a stone made ready by the hands of the workmen to be adjusted by the working tools of the fellow craft. The rough ashlar is the people as a mass, rude and unorganized. The perfect ashlar, or cubical stone, symbol of perfection, is the state. The rulers deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, the constitution and the laws speaking the will of the people. The government, harmonious, symmetrical, efficient, its powers properly distributed and duly adjusted in equilibrium. If we delineate a cube on a plane surface thus, we have visible 3 faces and 9 external lines drawn between 7 points. The complete cube has 3 more faces, making 6, 3 more lines, making 12, and 1 point, making 8, while its own 2 figures, 1, 2, added together, make the sacred number 3. It was called the perfect number, and the cube became the symbol of perfection." So he's basically saying that the citizens, the majority of the people on the planet, are unorganized, unrefined, not balanced, a little uneven, just like one of those ashlar bricks that just doesn't quite form a perfect square, has those jagged edges to it. It's just kind of rough. He's saying the people are a rough ashlar. And then on the other end, the state or the government represents the perfect ashlar, a perfect cube that's formed when the state has that ultimate power or ultimate control over the people, with the people agreeing to give them that power, which is adjusted by the working tools of the fellow craft. So basically controlled by the Freemasons. And if you look at the illustration of that cube, with it being shown at that specific angle to give you those 3 faces, 3 lines, the 6 points on each side with that 1 extra point in the middle. And then if you turn that cube around, you'd have the exact same thing on the opposite side. And all of that coming together to give you those exact sacred numbers and create the perfect ashlar. You can see that when a cube is laid out that way, what you get is a hexagon. So he's basically saying that the perfect form of the cube and the perfect symbol of government control is the hexagon. So if we go from there to page 102, in this part of the book, he starts delving into Satan and exactly who and what Satan is. It says, "The true name of Satan, the Kabbalists say, is that of Yahweh reversed. For Satan is not a black god, but the negation of God. The devil is the personification of atheism or idolatry. For the initiates, this is not a person, but a force created for good, but which may serve for evil. It is the instrument of liberty or free will. They represent this force, which presides over the physical generation under the mythological or horned form of the god Pan. Thence came the he-goat of the Sabbath, brother of the ancient serpent, and the light bearer, or phosphor, of which the poets have made the false Lucifer of the legend. So he brings up the devil, Pan, the he-goat of the Sabbath, so the Baphomet, the ancient serpent, Lucifer, all of these names that are being used to describe the same negative, low vibrational force, and that all ultimately point you back to Satan. And he's saying for the initiates, so for the people that practice Freemasonry, Satan is not an actual living, breathing person, but a force. So an energy that was created for good, but can serve for evil. So that goes back to that idea of the Baphomet, that we need both positive and negative energy to experience existence to the fullest. And the Baphomet basically representing bringing in that negative or evil energy onto the planet to the fullest extent. And he's saying that this force of Satan is represented by our free will, basically our ability to do whatever we want to do. Remember Aleister Crowley basing that whole Thelema religion around Satan, the Baphomet, the beast 666. And his main motto surrounding all of that being do what thou wilt. So basically not putting any boundaries on your free will. Or if you look at it here, giving fully into Satan. And he says that this force presides over the physical generation. So basically that Satan is the ruler of this physical world. And again, we've seen that illustrated with human beings being chained to that black cube of the devil. And you have to wonder, when he says they represent this force, is he talking about the initiates or the followers of Freemasonry? Because there are odd things like that statue of George Washington, one of the founding fathers and a prominent Freemason, depicted in nearly almost the exact same pose as the Baphomet. Then he says that Satan is not a black god, but the negation of God. So basically that Satan is the exact opposite of God. And in that line, Satan is not a black god. He's also giving you the negation of Satan, or the exact opposite of Satan, and saying that that exact opposite is a black god. Now, if we go back and take a second look at that astrological symbol for Capricornus, as far as that lower half, that fishtail, remember one of the earliest religious symbols was the ichthys, which was literally a fish. And there's this whole mystery behind the origins of this thing. Nobody seems to know where it originally came from, but eventually the early Christians adopted this symbol from somewhere and started to use it as a secret symbol to let other Christians know that they were also a Christian. So instead of coming out and admitting that they were a Christian in public and risk being killed, they would draw this fish symbol in the dirt or the sand and then quickly brush it away. And it was like an easy way to identify yourself as a Christian, because all you had to do was draw those two lines and basically turn it into an acronym or a sort of code word. So whenever one of them would say the word fish, what they'd actually be saying was Jesus. And the symbol eventually started to catch on. And by the 4th century, it was widespread all over the place, leading into today where you see it in front of church buildings and on the back of people's cars. You pretty much see it everywhere now. But again, they say that the origin of this symbol is a mystery. The early Christians adopted it from somewhere, but they have no clue where this thing originally came from. But it seems like a recurring theme in all of these ancient texts that the first physical thing in existence is always water. And then out of that water, we get the very first gods. It's something you constantly see in ancient mythology. And some of the oldest written history that we know of comes out of Mesopotamia or the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Syria, all around that region. And when you look into the ancient mythology of Mesopotamia, you're going to come across these beings called the Abkallu. And the Abkallu are these 7 demigods. So basically the offspring of the gods. And in the mythology, after the first human beings are placed on the earth, the gods send the Abkallu to teach human beings everything. How to read, how to write, how to farm, science, mathematics, everything. And also to teach them about the gods and how the gods created the world. And when the Abkallu come to the earth, they come from out of the ocean. They literally walk out of the ocean onto dry land. And the very first group of Abkallu that come to the earth are these human men wearing the carcass of a fish. They're literally described as human beings who have the carcass of a fish draped over the top of them, wearing these fish almost like a cloak, with the fish head covering the top of their head and the rest of the fish draped over their back, wearing these fish just like somebody would wear a robe. And they were looked at as the teachers of mankind, these wise men or sages, and more Abkallu would keep showing up. And based off of the mythology, these Abkallu are the ones who taught the people in each one of the ancient civilizations from the past. And there's artifacts all over different parts of the Middle East depicting the Abkallu. A lot of times they'll be in these ancient abandoned cities that are pretty much nothing but ruins. And in the middle of all of that, you'll have one of these Abkallu artifacts that survived all the destruction to the city still standing. But you also have the artifacts that have been excavated and moved to different museums. But they're almost always portrayed as these human men wearing these fish from head to toe, almost completely wrapped in this fish skin. They almost look like mermaids or mermen with that half man, half fish appearance. But it's a little bit more realistic because you got an actual human being wearing the skin of a fish. And they say that in Mesopotamia, people would actually take the small figurines of the Abkallu and bury them underneath the foundations of buildings. That's where they found a lot of them when they excavated, because people thought that these images of the Abkallu would protect them from evil spirits. And they'd usually set them out in sets of 7, because when the Abkallu showed up, they showed up in a group of 7. And in the mythology, after teaching mankind, the Abkallu stay on the earth for a long time before finally descending back into the water. But eventually, according to the myth, they all leave the earth. But they left what looks like this major impact on that ancient Mesopotamian culture with all these artifacts and all this mythology. Now, if we take a look at the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, cardinals, and bishops wear something called a mitre. And there is some conflict on the origins of the mitre and what it's actually supposed to mean. But the most widely accepted explanation is that it was pulled directly from Acts chapter 2 in the Bible. And this is basically like the moment when the disciples are given the power directly from God to preach to every nation, no matter what language. And when the Holy Spirit enters the room, it looks like 2 tongues of fire or 2 flames. And in the story, those flames come down and sit on each one of the disciples. And so the idea is that those 2 points on the mitre represent those 2 flames. Now, again, this isn't the official explanation. It's just the most widely accepted. And it makes sense because every single world leader, every president, every dictator of every single country all make a visit to the Vatican and meet with the Pope, no matter what language they speak, no matter what religion. So that symbology of having the power to reach every nation appointed by God makes a lot of sense. It's almost like you can see that playing out in plain sight. But that's just one aspect. There does seem to be another side to it. If you take the Pope wearing that mitre and then take that image of the Abkallu and place them together side by side and make a comparison, the mitre looks almost identical to that fish head. That open top of the mitre basically looks like the mouth of a fish. Even those 2 tails hanging down the back of the mitre, they call them lappets. They look really similar to those scales, or the body of that fish going down the back of the Abkallu. And even when you look into where the lappets, those 2 tails on the back, come from, again, the origins are apparently unknown. They have no clue where they originated from or what they mean. But the resemblance to the Abkallu is crazy. Now, when they wear the mitre, they usually wear it during ceremonial occasions. So during seasons like Advent, Lent, and different processions within the church. Now, in the Vatican in Rome, which is essentially the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church, it's worn on a lot of occasions, but specifically during Holy Mass, where they venerate the patron saints. And of course, you've got so many different forms of the patron saints all over the world. They look different depending on where you go. But inside of the Vatican in Rome, the depiction of the patron Saint Peter is black, a very dark black tone. And as one of the rituals of the Mass, the Pope, wearing the mitre along with the bishops, bows down to that statue of Saint Peter. And then the Pope and the Archbishop walk up and kiss the foot of Saint Peter. And this is at the very end of the Mass, by the way. This is what closes out the Mass. And this particular Mass is called the Feast of the Chair of Saint Peter, obviously because that statue of Saint Peter is sitting on that throne. And again, there's quite a few patron saints, but the head church in the Vatican in Rome is actually named St. Peter's Basilica. The entire church is actually named after this patron saint. So that already kind of gives you an idea of just how important this figure is to the Roman Catholic Church. But also, every single pope is required to wear a ring on their finger. It's called the Ring of the Fisherman. And again, every single pope is required to wear this ring. And the ring itself is engraved with an image of St. Peter. And if you notice on the ring, St. Peter is depicted with the halo above his head. And with the robe and the crown removed, you can see that that statue in the Vatican also has a permanent halo, literally a ring hovering over the head of this patron saint. Now remember, this is all located in Rome, controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. And remember, also in Rome, we had the Roman Empire, an empire that seemed to be obsessed with this god Saturn, with Saturnalia and all the Greek mythology, literally dedicating an entire festival to this god. They seem to be closely tied to this god, Saturn. And of course, we know Saturn is the one planet in our solar system with the largest visible halo circling around it. So you got to wonder, is this patron saint depiction of St. Peter just a continuation of that ancient Roman worship of Saturn? And we've seen the image of Shani and now St. Peter, and clearly they're both black. And the term Abkallu can actually be broken down into a compound, into two words, into the word Ab and into the word Kallu. And in Sanskrit, which is an ancient Indian language that is supposed to go back at least 4,000 years, the word Ab translates to the word water. And in Hindi, which is the official language in India, the term Kali means black. And you can actually see this with the Hindu goddess Kali, because her name literally translates to she who is black. And what's interesting is that Kali is looked at as the goddess of time, doomsday, and death. Those same exact traits that we see given to the planet Saturn. And within the same family, you have the word Kallu, which in India is actually seen as a derogatory term against black people. It's pretty much like using the N-word with the ER on the end. Actually, just recently, there was a West Indies cricket player who came out claiming racism against his own teammates because they were constantly calling him Kallu. They actually called him Kallu so much that it became his nickname among the team. And this went on for years. And it wasn't until recent where he found out that that was considered a racist term. And, you know, he went on to publicly call out his teammates on it. But more than likely, it's the same exact case as every other racist term used against dark-skinned people, where the word originally started out meaning dark or black. And then over the span of history, it got morphed into this racist derogatory word. But just with the way it's used now, you can easily see that it fits. And ultimately, it just translates to black people. So again, you've got the word Ab, meaning water. And then you've got the word Kallu, which is referring to black people. And when you take those two terms, that compound, and you put it together, you get Abkallu, black people from the water. But we also have some science, because melanin has the ability to split the water molecule. And by split, meaning that it can literally split water in half. Because when you think about how melanin absorbs the rays of the sun, there's a lot of heat building up during that process, and a whole lot of electromagnetic activity to cause melanin to absorb those sun rays. And when the water splits, the hydrogen and oxygen starts to increase. And you go from just that basic H2O to a lot more hydrogen and oxygen atoms. And once all of that starts to cool down, all of that hydrogen and oxygen bonds back together, and you actually end up with more water than you had before the water split. But if you think about how water splitting works and how you have that increase in hydrogen and oxygen, and then think about how the most popular idea of how life started on Earth is that it started with water. You know, they always say without water, there would be no life. But how did that water expand and spread all over the Earth? Well, again, if you think about how melanin causes water to split and how that process ultimately creates more water, it would seem like one of the key elements in developing life on Earth would be melanin. And when you look at the chemical structure of melanin, carbon is the most prevalent element in melanin. You have hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, but nothing is more prevalent in melanin than carbon. And carbon, as its own separate element, is hydrophobic, meaning that water has little to no effect on it. And it basically repels water. And we're talking about pure carbon, that dark black element that hasn't been mixed with any other elements. You can submerge it all the way into the water. And it's so hydrophobic that it will literally build a barrier around itself and the water. And you'll be able to see like the barrier wrapped around this carbon as you move it around the water. It's crazy. And when you pull it back out of the water, it's just as dry as when you put it in, because again, there's little to no interaction between that carbon and the water. And when you first attempt to put it into the water, because it's so repellent to the water, it won't sink into the water. It actually just floats on top of the water with that same exact barrier wrapped around it. If you try to pour water onto it, it literally just either bounces right off of the carbon, or the water sits on top of the carbon in the form of perfectly formed water droplets. It's pretty much nearly impossible to soak this element, carbon, in water. You just can't get it wet. Carbon is literally the perfect water resistant element. Now, keep in mind that the average melanin chemical compound in the average human being has about 18 carbon atoms that make up that melanin polymer. But just imagine a human being with more. We're all carbon-based beings. All life is carbon-based, but there's nobody that we can see with that carbon black hue. But if you look at how carbon interacts with water, and then you look at the Abkallu, or the black people from the water, those half man, half fish, and that mythology of the Abkallu emerging from the water, it really all seems to fit. There is some similarity between the science and the mythology. And also think about the evolution theory, and how at the very core of that theory is this idea that human life started in the water, and that after going from that single cell in those microbial organisms, the very first thing that human beings evolved into was a fish. So based off of that theory, our oldest ancestor would be a fish. And eventually this fish emerged from the water onto dry land and was the one to take those first steps towards the evolution of human life. So the question is, how much of that is actually pointing back to that mythology of the Abkallu? And remember, in the mythology, the Abkallu are demigods. They're the offspring of the gods. And they're actually brought into existence by a god named Ea or Enki. And in the mythology, Enki is the one who actually sets up order on the planet. He sets up all the different nations and then assigns all the different gods to different parts of the world. And he was also considered the Lord of Apsu, or the Lord of the deep water under the earth, which was also where you could find the temple of Enki, the same place where the Abkallu came from. He was also considered a creator god, and he was looked at as the one who was responsible for creating human beings. Now, the god Enki was associated with semen and amniotic fluid. So we're talking about fertility, reproduction, vitality, creation, and life, basically. All high energy aspects. And the symbol used to represent Enki was a half goat, half fish. And there are physical artifacts of this goatfish symbology throughout Mesopotamia. The majority of them ended up in the Hearst Museum in California. And you can see it's just like that astrological symbol for Capricornus. You've got the upper half of a goat attached to the lower half of a fish. That same exact hybrid between the two, with the goat head, hind legs, and the fishtail. And there's also artifacts for the god Enki himself. And you can see he's depicted as half man, half fish, similar to the Abkallu, but obviously he's portrayed a lot more like a mermaid or a merman, because you got that upper body of a human and then that entire lower body of a fish. And remember, in the mythology, the Abkallu are the offspring of the gods, and they come from this much more major god, Enki. Now, remember, the goatfish is supposed to represent Enki, one of the original gods and one of the very first beings on the earth in the Mesopotamian mythology. And there's actually a fish in nature called a goatfish. And one of the interesting traits of the goatfish is that it's able to camouflage itself. The goatfish will instantly change color in order to match its environment. They're really covert and elusive fish. But just think about how one of the major characteristics of these goatfish is their ability to camouflage themselves, to hide themselves, and stay out of sight. And this same exact fish, this fish that tries to keep itself hidden, is being used to symbolize what would be one of the very first beings on the planet, one of the most ancient beings, one of the most ancient gods. And through astrology, it's being used to represent Capricornus, which is linked directly to Saturn. So it's almost like the goatfish is symbolic for something that we don't see, but something that is definitely there, hiding in plain sight, which again would eventually turn into the sea goat of Capricornus. Again, we have the goat, which can be connected to the devil, the Baphomet, Satan, evil, and just your lower nature. And then we have the fish, which seems to be connected to the highest energy possible, life itself. Also knowledge, wisdom, and ultimately God, things pertaining to your higher nature. So looking at the symbol of the sea goat or the goatfish, it's really almost like looking at a yin and yang symbol. God and Satan, good and evil, higher self, lower self. It's those two polar opposites, the negative and the positive, brought together as one. It's like you're getting all of that, all of these things that we can see. It's like it's all tied into this one symbol. So literally it's everything. And remember, this is the symbol for Capricornus, which again is ruled by Saturn. Now, if you notice, wherever you see Saturn, you also always tend to see a lot of symbolism dealing with the color black. The black gods, the black cube. It's almost like black and Saturn go hand in hand. And so the question is, what is up with that connection between Saturn and the color black? Well, there's a very old form of chemistry, a really ancient scientific practice called alchemy. And there were two different types of alchemists. You had the alchemists who would try to transform metal, and then you had spiritual alchemists, the alchemists who were trying to use those same steps of alchemy to strengthen the spiritual side of themselves and to get that spiritual side to the highest level that it could go. So basically to really reach that state of mind over matter and to get to the point where they weren't affected by things like disease and even death. And this whole process was broken down into 7 steps. And those 7 steps were symbolized by the 7 rungs of a ladder, with that final step or that final rung representing full spiritual enlightenment or full transformation, bringing the physical side completely together with the spiritual side. And the very first step on that ladder, called calcination, is connected to the planet Saturn. And Saturn is connected to the root chakra and represented by lead. It's being used to represent the lowest state of the mind. Because if you think about it, lead is one of the heaviest metals. So it can be really hard to maneuver and to handle. But at the same time, it's very soft. All it takes is the scratch of a fingernail to put an impression into lead. So it's very easy to manipulate the shape of lead. It's also one of the most dangerous metals. And when dealing with it, you got to worry about things like lead poisoning, which builds up in the body slowly over time. So at this stage, you can look at the mind in the same way. Hard to handle, but easily manipulated, easily reshaped, and easily reformed. And a high possibility of being extremely toxic if it's not handled the right way. And then with the root chakra, obviously out of all the 7 chakras, the root chakra is the lowest chakra. And so it's dealing with your lower nature, your basic instincts. And it's basically the foundation of all the rest of the chakras. So if that root chakra is unbalanced, it pretty much sends everything else out of whack. You can pretty much forget about all the rest of the chakras. That root chakra is where the stability of everything else starts. And when you have an unstable root chakra, it means that you're basically given completely into the physical and allowing yourself to be controlled by your lower nature. And the root chakra is connected to the earth. So it's the one chakra that keeps you grounded here and can keep you grounded here if you never learn how to control it, how to discipline it. And then the color of the root chakra is also red. But just think about an unstable root chakra, somebody giving fully into their lower nature. And then think about that classic depiction of the red devil and that idea that the devil uses all of the riches and the pleasures of the physical world to tempt you and to ultimately take control of you and to bring you down to his level and to get you to serve him and ultimately to destroy you. You know how they say an idle mind is the devil's playground. So a mind that's not being put to use is vulnerable to the temptations of the devil. So you've got the red devil and the red root chakra, or your lower self, your lower nature, which is being worked on in that first step of alchemy. And this is all happening through a process called calcination. And in chemistry, calcination is the process of raising a solid object up to a high temperature, just below the melting point. And the purpose is to remove any toxic substances, any impurities, and sometimes even removing any organic matter. And it can literally be looked at as a process of purification. So think about that from a spiritual standpoint. Removing impurities, removing toxic elements, and separating yourself from matter. Removing matter from the equation and starting that process of allowing the mind to take over matter. It's kind of what you're getting from this process of calcination from an alchemical standpoint. Now, because this first step is all about burning away all those toxins, impurities, and using that heat to remove yourself from that matter. And because all of this is connected to Saturn, in alchemy, Saturn is actually looked at as the black sun. And this process of calcination is called the negrito, or the blackness. And because it's the first stage in this process of alchemy, it's also the most difficult and the most negative stage. So they usually use what looks like a lot of dark, scary imagery to illustrate this process, because it's supposed to be the most frightening step, letting go of physical attachments, things that you might want to hold on to, but you actually need to let go of. It's the most difficult stage because it's literally like a full detox from the physical, letting go of the material world completely. And through this concept, the black sun, or Saturn, is supposed to be at the forefront of all of this, making this process happen. Now, this black sun symbolism would also end up getting adopted by the Nazis in Germany. They never used it out in the open, but there's a large mosaic of the black sun inside one of the Nazi castles in Germany. And there's supposed to be all this mystery surrounding what they actually used it for. Nobody really has an answer as to what the connection between the black sun and the Nazis was. But we know for sure that Hitler and the Nazis went around to all these ancient civilizations stealing information. And that's how they eventually got the swastika. And some people actually think it was the substitute for the swastika. And it was supposed to represent the rise of the Aryan race and their conquest to dominate and take complete control of the planet. And eventually you would get neo-Nazi groups and other white supremacist groups who would adopt this same symbol of the black sun. You'll see it on flags, shirts, posters, websites that are all connected to these white extremist groups. And on top of the white supremacists, the black sun was also adopted by some groups of Satanists. They used the black sun in the same way as the Baphomet to represent that extreme level of satanic energy, or that lower nature pan energy. And from alchemy, we know that that black sun is pointing back to Saturn. But looking at it from a scientific standpoint, a black sun would technically be a dead star, because when a star dies, if it doesn't completely collapse on itself and become a black hole, then as soon as it cools down and no longer emits any heat or light, it becomes a black dwarf. At least that's the theory anyway. But you got to wonder, where did the inspiration for that theory come from? Now, remember, there is that idea floating out there that at one point Saturn was literally our sun, that it replaced the sun that we see in the sky today. And so when the people in these ancient civilizations looked up in the sky, they would see Saturn, just like we can look up and see the sun today. And when you look at Saturn through a telescope, with the way that it's positioned in the sky, from our vantage point, you can see the planet itself, and then you can see the majority of the rings of Saturn surrounding the planet. And from that vantage point, with the planet in the middle and those rings surrounding the planet, Saturn looks a lot like an eye. It looks like you have the pupil of an eye surrounded by the frame of an eye. And so you can imagine, if Saturn was closer to the Earth at some point in the past, when people looked up in the sky, this is what they would have seen. It literally would have looked like an eye in the sky looking down on the planet. Now, we know that Egypt is one of the oldest known civilizations that we know of. And when you look at all of the hieroglyphs and all of the monuments, one of the symbols that you see throughout Egypt the most is the eye. You can find the eye all throughout Egypt. And then more specifically in Egyptian mythology, you have the eye of Horus and the eye of Ra, two different eyes that look identical. But of course, those two different eyes both have their own separate origin stories. Now, with the eye of Horus, Horus is the son of two of the most ancient gods, Isis and Osiris. And Horus's father, Osiris, is killed by his own brother, Set, because Set wanted to take his position as the supreme god. But there was one thing in the way of that. Isis and Osiris had a son, Horus. And being Osiris's son, Horus held that rightful position as the supreme god. So Set set out to kill Horus and finally take over as the supreme god. Now, fast forward a little bit, and Horus and Set are battling for the throne. And during that battle, Set gouges out Horus's left eye, literally pulls his eye out. But even despite that, Horus is able to fight off Set, and Set flees. He runs away and the battle ends. But now Horus has lost his left eye. So Horus goes to one of the elder gods, Hathor, and Hathor restores his eye. And when Horus's eye is fully restored, he offers it over to his father, Osiris, hoping that it can somehow restore his life. And the eye of Horus will go on to symbolize sacrifice, healing, restoration, and protection. And then we have the eye of Ra. And in this version of the mythology, Ra is the supreme god, but he's getting old and he's kind of starting to lose his influence over the people. So he goes to his father, an even more ancient god named Nun. And Nun, by the way, literally represents the ancient waters, the water that has been around since the beginning of time that everything came from. But Ra goes to his father, Nun, and asks him how he can get back the respect and the reverence of the people. So Nun tells him to sit on his throne and take out his right eye. And the eye immediately takes on its own form and becomes the goddess Sekhmet. And Sekhmet is this bloodthirsty god that immediately goes out and starts causing total destruction. She just continually moves through the earth, causing death everywhere she goes. And when Ra tries to get her to stop, she just keeps going, like she is hell bent on destruction. So Ra sets up a council with the rest of the gods and the people, and they devise this plan to trick Sekhmet, to bait her in with this vial of blood that's also been contaminated with some stuff that will make her pass out. So Sekhmet falls for it, and while she's out, Ra takes away about half of her power. And when she wakes up, she's still bloodthirsty and still a god of destruction, but now she only uses that power to protect things. And after this, Ra steps down from his throne, and this is when Osiris, the father of Horus, becomes the new supreme god. So from these two mythologies, you can see you have two gods sitting on the same throne, representing the two opposite sides of that throne, the left eye and the right eye. And with that left eye, you're getting healing, restoration, life, positive energy. And then that right eye is connected to destruction, chaos, and death. So of course, negative energy. So you got negative, positive, good, evil. You've got these dual energies being represented by these two eyes, two opposing sides of the same source. Now, once the federal government of the United States was established in the early 1700s, we would get the Great Seal of the United States, the bald eagle on the front and the Eye of Providence on the back. But if you take a closer look at that right side with the 13 stars and the bald eagle, and look closely at those 13 stars and how they're arranged. Now, if you notice, they're perfectly aligned to form a hexagram. The stars are lined up in just the right position to give you a hexagram. And then if you notice, you also have a hexagon surrounding that hexagram. And remember, those 13 stars represent the 13 colonies that originally formed the United States. But interestingly enough, you also had 13 states that made up the Confederacy. And this is why when you look at the Confederate flag, it has 13 stars on it. Then just below that in Latin, we have E pluribus unum, which translates to out of many, one. And then just below that is the bald eagle, holding the olive branch on the left and holding arrows on the right. And of course, that olive branch symbolizes peace and the arrows symbolize war. So you've got two dueling energies, just like the eye of Horus and the eye of Ra. Positive energy on the left, negative energy on the right. Now, what's interesting about the bald eagle is that in Greek mythology, the god Zeus would sometimes take on the form of an eagle. He would literally transform himself into an eagle. And there's one particular story in Greek mythology where Zeus is looking down from the heavens and notices a young boy named Ganymede. And Zeus becomes infatuated. So Zeus creates a storm and then transforms into his eagle form. And then he flies down, swoops up Ganymede, and takes him back up into the clouds and brings him to his bedside. A lot of people believe that this story wasn't added in until the 5th century, and that the Greco-Romans added it in later because you have writings from Plato about this myth where he literally said that the Greco-Romans made up this story to justify their quote unquote unnatural pleasures. And if that's the case, then this eagle would be more akin to the Baphomet, a representation of that satanic Pan energy. And there's definitely a Greek connection to this eagle because just above the eagle, you have Latin writing. Then on the left, we have the eye of providence. And at the very top in Latin is Annuit Coptis, which translates to he has favored our undertakings. And they say that he is supposed to be a reference to God. And then at the bottom is Novus Ordo Seclorum, which translates from Latin to a new order of the ages. Now remember, E pluribus unum translates to out of many, one. And so this is where we get a lot of people talking about the one world order or the new world order. And then you have the 13 steps of that half pyramid, which again are supposed to represent the 13 colonies leading up to the top of the pyramid, which is the all-seeing eye hovering over those 13 steps, almost like an eye in the sky with that light illuminating from it as if it was a sun. So you got a question, what is the all-seeing eye? Is it a sun? Are we looking at the eye of Horus, the eye of Ra? What's going on? Well, if we look at what would seem to be the upper echelon of society, the celebrities, public figures, people with large amounts of notoriety and influence over the masses, at one point or another, you can find instances of what seems like them all doing the same exact thing, throwing up this one eye symbolism. You have all these instances of all these celebrities doing the same exact thing, placing their hand over one of their eyes and leaving just one eye visible. And like I said, it's not just one. It seems like you have just about all of them doing this. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find a public figure with some type of celebrity to their name who hasn't done it at one point or another. Musicians, actors, actresses, politicians, anybody with a little bit of notoriety has done this one eye symbolism. And again, it'd be one thing if it was just a few people, but it literally seems like everybody. And it's not just some recent trend, because you can go as far back as the 50s and 60s and still find celebrities and the popular figures during those times making the exact same hand gesture, covering one eye and only exposing that one eye, just giving you that one eye. And it seems to stretch all over the world, no matter what part of the world. The people with influence, the people with stardom, all seem to be throwing up this same thing. And it's not impossible that there's some world-renowned photographer who just loves to take shots of people in this exact same pose. But it's happening all over the world and spanning across different decades, not to mention different industries. And yet everybody is doing the same exact hand gesture. And when you think about it, the one thing that all of these people have in common is that they're all big name personalities. They all have fame and they all have stardom. That celebrity status is the one thing that connects all of them together. So these are the people that are reaping the benefits of society on a large scale. Billionaires, multimillionaires. All of these people are a part of the upper class of society. People who are really reaping the benefits of the material world. And then they have the fame and the notoriety to go along with it. So their material success is on public display for the masses. Everybody is witnessing that success and also watching them reap the benefits of that success, experiencing material gain at the highest level. And remember that full indulgence into the material world, into the physical, is going to lead you to Satan. Because when you fully give into the material world, it becomes matter over mind, that upside down pentagram, just like human beings being chained to that black cube of the devil. And remember those characteristics of the devil, tempting you with the riches and the pleasures of the material world and trying to keep you trapped in your lower nature. And it seems like they're pretty much giving it to you clear as day as to what this one eye symbolism is alluding to. It's like it's all right there in plain sight. You have high profile personalities being used to tempt you with all the things of the material world. And so that one eye is like a universal signal for being a part of that. And it may not even be that deep for a lot of these celebrities. A lot of them might just be posing the way they're being told by a photographer, and that's the end of it. But that still doesn't take away from the influence that these people have over the masses and that power to be able to sway the focus of the masses and to keep the general focus of the masses on the material world. But there is times where the symbolism is so blatant and so in your face that you got to wonder just how much do some of these people really know? And it's hard not to think that they might know a lot more than they're letting on. Sometimes the subliminal messages that some of these people put out are just so blatantly obvious that it just makes you wonder. It's almost like they're just giving it to you outright. And again, maybe they're just posing the way they're being told to pose, and they have no clue where any of this stuff could possibly go. But the symbolism is there. But it seems like there's even more there, because there's times when they'll put the two fingers over their eye, and it's clearly alluding back to Egypt and back to the eye of Horus and the eye of Ra. And the only question would be, which eye are they representing? Well, with the rest of this symbolism seemingly leading back to Satan and the material world, lower nature, it seems like a good guess would be the eye with the most negative and low vibrational aspects, because the symbolism from a lot of these people gets even more blatant. A lot of them will throw up what looks like that OK hand sign, and they'll usually put it right over their eye. And again, at face value, it seems like nothing, seems pretty innocent. But again, with these celebrities, we're dealing with a heavy promotion of the material world. And if you really look at that OK hand sign with the two fingers making a circle and then the three fingers going up, it kind of looks like 3 6s overlapping each other. It looks really similar. If you layer 3 6s on top of each other, you get something that looks almost identical to this hand sign. And one of the other places that you'll find 3 6s is with a hexagon. A hexagon has 6 sides, 6 vertices, and 6 angles. So a hexagon is giving you those 3 6s, but you also get 3 6s from carbon. About 98% of all carbon is what's called carbon 12. And carbon 12 is made up of 6 electrons, 6 protons, and 6 neutrons. Now remember, all organic life is carbon based. So pretty much all organic life is going to be based on carbon 12. But here's the thing, there's also carbon 13 that makes up that other 1.5% of all carbon-based life. And again, carbon 13 makes up less than 1.5% of all organic life on the earth. While again, the majority of life on earth is based on carbon 12, those 3 sixes. So the majority of the material world is based on 3 sixes. And again, we've got these celebrities who heavily promote the material world and represent the highest level of physical success, throwing up what looks like 3 sixes. And in a lot of cases, placing those sixes over their eye. And from the looks of it, that eye is ultimately taking you back to Saturn. And of course, we've got that hexagon on Saturn. And the hexagon, again, is going to take you back to 3 sixes. And ultimately going to take you back to carbon 12, which is going to lead you to the physical world, or at least a good portion of it. So you have all these celebrities throwing up what looks like 3 sixes. And it's another thing that they've been doing for decades. You got pretty much every single person with any type of notoriety, any type of fame doing it. There's almost not a time that you can't go back and find the people with stardom, the people with celebrity status throwing up this hand sign. I mean, it's just decades and decades of what seems like literally everybody doing it. All the people with the most influence over society. And again, all the people with the most material success. They're all throwing up 3 sixes. And not just the actors, musicians, politicians, and the athletes. I mean, it's literally everybody with any type of influence. Everybody with the high level of material success in front of the public eye. At some point in their career, you'll find that they've flashed this hand sign. And again, it stretches across different industries and is spread out throughout history. And there's times when you'll see them throw this hand sign up, and they'll also be throwing up what looks like a set of horns right along with it. And it's easy to think nothing of it. But we know if you trace it back far enough, those horns can lead you back to the god Pan, the goat, the Baphomet, and all of that is going to ultimately lead you back to Satan. And just think about the connection. Again, you've got these celebrities seemingly playing a key role in keeping you focused on the material. So metaphorically helping to keep you chained to that black cube of the devil, keeping your attention focused on the things of the physical world, all of the things that the devil would use to pull you in and keep you trapped. You know, fortune, fame, material possessions, an abundance of physical pleasure, keeping you trapped in your root chakra. And like I said, some of these people may not realize just exactly what they're promoting. They might genuinely be completely out of the loop, but then there's the ones that take it to the next level, wearing clothes with the upside down pentagram, the Baphomet, and wearing all this stuff with the goat symbology right out in the open, wearing shirts with Aleister Crowley on them, walking around with shirts with his face on it, even with his "do what thou wilt" quote. Then you've got the celebrities that are literally walking around with the numbers 666, just blatantly letting you know exactly what they're about. 666 plastered big as day right on their shirt for everybody to see. I mean, we even know before Biggie Smalls passed away, he was planning on starting his own clothing line, and it was literally going to be called 666. And you can see him and the rest of Junior Mafia wearing some of the clothes just before he passed away. Again, seemingly just giving it to you outright what these people are about and what their role is in that position as the influencers of the masses. Biggie Smalls was all about promoting that low vibrational gutter hip hop. And a lot of people don't like to talk about it, but he got really dark with a lot of his lyrics. And this is the type of stuff that when you listen to it repeatedly, it can be really damaging to your mind because those lyrics are speaking to your lower nature. And even if it's not affecting you consciously, it can still be doing all types of damage to you subconsciously. But yeah, you got all these celebrities wearing all this different stuff, seemingly using all this different symbolism and throwing up all these different hand signs that all seem to go back to Satan, that seem to correlate with negative, low vibrational energy. Again, keeping you trapped in the material. Again, you'd be hard pressed to find an influential person who hasn't thrown up that OK hand sign. And here's the crazy part. In 2017, the OK hand sign was officially considered a hate symbol. And supposedly it started out as a joke, but eventually you had a bunch of different white supremacist groups that started to use this hand sign. The three fingers are supposed to create a W for white. And then that circle is supposed to form a P for power. And again, you've got a bunch of different white supremacist groups that are using this hand sign. Now, if you notice, all of this symbolism that can lead you back to Saturn and to Satan is also going to always lead you back to the oppression of black people. It's the exact same thing with the black sun. You've had people throwing up this OK hand sign for decades. Any and everybody, literally everybody with any type of influence and high levels of success within this system. They've all thrown up the OK hand sign, or what looks like those 3 6s. And then you fast forward to today, and now this same hand sign is being associated with white power. So we've got Saturn, Satan, 3 6s, the material world, and black oppression by white people, all seemingly being connected together in some type of way. Now you got to understand, this hand sign has been around for a very long time. And in Hinduism and Buddhism, each finger has a different meaning. And when you place different fingers together, you get different interpretations. And when the fingers are placed in this position, it's called the Gyian Mudra, or the mudra of knowledge. Now, the word mudra just means a hand gesture. And this particular mudra is focused on strengthening the mind, sharpening your memory, strengthening your brain capacity, and basically bringing out the full potential of the mind. Now, remember, you got all these influential people throwing up something that looks identical to the Gyian Mudra. And remember, these are all the people that have the strongest influence over the minds of the masses. People who convey different levels of knowledge to the general public. And their main function, again, seems to be getting you to focus all your attention on the material world. So getting you to allow your matter to take over your mind. And then a lot of times they take that Gyian Mudra and they place it over their eye. And of course, from everything we can see, it looks like that eye is pointing back to Saturn. So it's almost like it's hinting at Saturn controlling the mind of the masses and keeping the masses trapped in the material world. Now, another thing that you see a lot, the upside down cross. And I think we all know it's a blatant sign of Satanism, taking the traditional cross and turning it on its head. It almost doesn't get any more blatant, because we know that that upside down cross goes back to the Church of Satan. And outside of the pentagram, it's like one of the most recognizable satanic symbols out there. But believe it or not, people who practice Satanism actually adopted this symbol from the early Christians, because in Christianity, the upside down cross is actually called St. Peter's cross, because, you know, St. Peter was one of the 12 disciples, and he denied being a disciple and being associated with Jesus 3 different times. You had 3 different times where 3 different people asked him if he was a disciple and if he knew Jesus. And all 3 times he said no. So there's this belief by the Catholic Church that because of how much Peter turned his back on Jesus, after Jesus was crucified, Peter felt like he wasn't worthy of being crucified in the same way that Jesus was. So he personally asked the Roman guards to crucify him upside down. And so for the Catholics, St. Peter's cross became a symbol of humility. And you can actually see them using this cross during different processions. And specifically the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican. Because remember how important St. Peter is as a patron saint to the Vatican. So much so that, again, they named the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church St. Peter's Basilica in honor of St. Peter. And remember how they depict St. Peter in the Vatican as that dark, black figure that they dress up in royalty with the crown and the robe. And then underneath that crown is that permanent halo, which, again, because we're dealing with the Romans, you can't discount that connection between that halo of St. Peter and that halo around Saturn. And remember, with the astrological symbol for Saturn, you also have a cross, and that cross represents matter. And then when you fold that cross and bring it into a third dimensional form, it becomes a cube. So looking at the cross from a third dimensional form, no matter how you turn it, whether it's right side up or upside down, in that third dimensional form, it's still going to always be a cube. So just like with the goatfish, the eye of Horus, the eye of Ra, with the right side up cross or the upside down cross, you've got two dueling energies, two opposite forces coming from the same source. So when you actually look at it with that upside down cross representing somebody that's unfit of being looked at as Christ-like, and because of that connection to Satanism, it's almost like the Pope and everybody in the Vatican is bowing down and paying homage to that satanic, low vibrational half of this cube that represents the full spectrum of duality, the good, the evil, the negative, the positive. It's all coming from the same source, and they're sending all their energy to that negative side. And it's just like in Hinduism with the god Shani, with Shani being that physical manifestation of Saturn. And of course, Saturn is linked to the root chakra. And so because of that, Shani rules over the lower nature of humanity. And in Hinduism, when you're working with Shani, you're basically working to discipline your lower self and bring about that balance of the lowest part of yourself, the root chakra, the foundation. And in order for that to happen, you have to face all those negative aspects head on. In order to learn how to balance them, you have to experience them. And so Shani is known for manifesting those negative aspects and actually bringing obstacles and adversaries into your life, into your path, for you to work through and move forward into that more balanced state. And another interesting thing is that the only way to decrease those negative effects of Shani, other than working your way through them, is to worship him and to basically give into your lower self, your root chakra. And if you worship him, you gain power and success within the material world. But it's a give and take, because you also don't overcome Shani, and you basically stay stuck in Saturn, in that root chakra. Remember, the root chakra, just like Saturn, is connected to the earth. And so if you give into it, it keeps you grounded on the earth, and you never reach that next level. Now, there was a guy that worked as a mechanical engineer at NASA named Norman Bergrun, and he wrote a book in 1986 called The Ringmakers of Saturn. Now, Saturn has quite a few rings, but just 3 main rings. And those 3 main rings are the largest rings and also the brightest rings, the rings that we can see from a distance with the naked eye. And that's rings A, B, and C, with the A ring being the furthest away from the planet and the C ring being the closest. And the space between these rings are called divisions, the gaps between each ring. And again, Saturn has a lot of rings, so there's also a lot of divisions or gaps. But the 2 largest divisions are between the A ring and the B ring. You have the Cassini division in the B ring, which is the largest division or the largest gap. And then in the A ring, you have the Enki division. Now, in his book, The Ringmakers of Saturn, Norman Bergrun pointed out some of the odd things that he noticed while looking at the images from the Voyager probe. And basically, he noticed that when looking at the same exact section of Saturn's rings from two separate probes, the rings looked different. The same exact section that was photographed by Voyager 1 looked a lot different when it was photographed by Voyager 2. It actually looked like the rings were expanding or growing from one image to the next. So he kept looking deeper into all the photographs of Saturn from the Cassini probe and the Voyager probe. And he started to pinpoint what he thought to look like these bright objects. He called them luminous sources hanging around the rings of Saturn. And the more he analyzed these things, the more he noticed that wherever he saw these luminous sources, he also saw these long, narrow, bright lines. And they looked like they had some type of structure to them. And he started to propose that these luminous sources or these light sources were coming from these structures and were like some type of residue coming off of these structures that seemed to be attaching themselves to the rings of Saturn. And as he started analyzing them more, he started to notice even more of the structure of these objects, and that it was almost shaped like a cylinder. And that's when he started referring to these things as vehicles. And because he was always spotting them near the edges of the rings of Saturn, and because of that drastic change in the size of the rings of Saturn that he had seen between Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, he started to theorize that either these vehicles were forming the rings of Saturn, siphoning material from the rings of Saturn, or both. But he definitely strongly believed that there was a link between these vehicles and the divisions in Saturn's rings, and specifically the two main divisions, Cassini and Enki. And so with all that in mind, he started referring to these things as electromagnetic vehicles, aka the ring makers of Saturn. And because of everything that he had come across in his data, he pretty much believed that anywhere where you could find rings around the planet, you could also find these vehicles. And he believed that there was a good chance that they were all over the solar system. Now, eventually he did an interview about his findings, and this thing ended up going viral. And in the interview, he was asked if he had come across any evidence of there being actual sentient life inside these vehicles.
From Project Camelot, we are here with Norm Bergrum. He was with NACA, which was the early precursor of NASA. Yes. And he also worked for Ames Research. He has also worked for Lockheed Martin, before it was Lockheed Martin. And he has written a book called The Ringmakers of Saturn. And so when you're talking about the craft in the rings of Saturn, you're talking about something huge, right?
Yes.
Much bigger than we could even conceive of, I understand. What is it? I don't know. What was it? 70,000 square feet.
I could, in looking down on the rings, I could see parallel lines crossing the ring, all the rings at once. Mm-hmm. That's about as long as you can get them.
That's incredible.
But I could tell that those lines demarked the outside of an object. Mm-hmm. And that's how I came up with the scale I present in there of different lengths of these things.
Well, did we build it?
Pardon?
Did we build it? Who built it? The craft?
I don't know who built it, but what I found out is these things inhabit Saturn. That's where I first discovered them, and they're proliferating. They're now Uranus and Jupiter. Wherever you see some rings now, why, that's one of these.
You see the craft.
Yeah, I call it a ring maker.
Okay, you call it a ring maker.
Yeah, and I can say it's electromagnetic because I could identify streamline patterns with respect to it that I knew were what we call potential lines, and that says it was electrical. Somebody comes along and says, well, now where would you manufacture one that's 2.5 Earth lengths long? And that's a hard question to answer. However, if you think of it in terms of its living entity, it's just another kind of thing that we've got in our universe. And it can grow and grow and grow and grow.
Okay, but if there are craft, there are beings.
Okay, people have asked me about, I call them vehicles, okay?
Right.
Now, I did not call them objects. That was too neuter for me.
Okay.
I had a Stanford professor said you ought to call them objects. No. They have all of the qualities of a vehicle. Mm-hmm. They can move. They're just like a missile or anything like that. So that much we can say about them, for sure.
Okay.
So I'm calling it a vehicle.
Okay. So are you not positing the idea that those vehicles contain, beings who are, maybe like us?
Yeah, I only go along with government images. And if you want to know about people kind of thing, there is the ship that picked up the Voyager capsule at Alameda Naval Shipyard, and they have a picture there of I think it's the Apollo flight that Buzz and Neil were on. But anyway, there is one image there that shows black people getting off.
So people with dark skin getting off.
Not dark, black.
Black skin.
Really black. Yeah.
Were they tall?
Yes.
Very tall?
Yeah.
How tall? Do you know?
Well, they got out the doorway. I don't know how high that is, but
Well, what?
it's safe. 7 feet would be probably a conservative estimate.
Have you heard about Clark McClellan's statement about that?
No.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Have you ever been in touch with him?
No.
No?
I have tried to stay independent and not be affected by others' opinions.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that we're communicating with them? Have you had any evidence of that?
Oh, no.
No?
We are not capable of doing that. SETI has tried to communicate with extraterrestrials, and they haven't done it yet. They have chosen the type of person, the type of entity that they want to communicate with is somebody that knows how to build radios.
Right.
That constrains them in their thinking immensely.
Now, eventually, when the Cassini probe was sent to Saturn in 1997, it was able to pick up more detailed images of the planet, with it being a lot more advanced than Voyager. And when they captured the Cassini images of Saturn's rings, they saw that what was causing the divisions in the rings was actually Saturn's moons. Because, Saturn has a lot of moons. There's at least 82 that they know of so far. And some of these moons actually create these divisions in the rings, usually by pulling different pieces of the rings into their gravitational field. And remember, one of the two main divisions where Norman Berggren said he saw the evidence of those vehicles, the Enki division in Saturn's A ring. They also refer to it as Enki's gap. And what they found through Cassini was that Enki's division, or Enki's gap, was being caused by the moon, Pan. It's actually located inside of the gap, and it just kind of orbits around this part of the rings and keeps this gap open, this 200-mile wide division. And apparently this thing is moving fast. They estimate it to be orbiting around Saturn at about 42 miles per hour. And again, as it moves through, it keeps this division open and creates the Enki gap. And NASA is actually referring to this thing as the god of the gap, because of course it's named after the god Pan. And they say that they named it after the god Pan because he was a god of the wild and a shepherd, and the moon Pan kind of acts like a shepherd, forcing all those ring particles out of the way to create that division. But really, think about what they're saying. The moon Pan is creating the Enki division. Remember, Pan, the goat, and Enki, the fish. The goat fish, the astrological symbol for Capricornus, which takes you back to Saturn. And remember, the goatfish is also the symbol of Enki, one of the oldest gods in the Sumerian pantheon. And according to the Sumerian mythology, the god responsible for creating human beings. Now, again, think about it. Pan is causing a division in Enki. And when you look at Pan, Pan itself, out of all of Saturn's moons, Pan is one of the smallest moons. It's literally only 8 miles wide, but it still has this huge effect on Saturn's rings. And it's also one of the most oddly shaped moons. It's got that weird shape to it. Some people say it looks like a walnut or a ravioli, but really take a good look at this thing. To me, it looks a lot like a mutated version of Saturn. It looks like the planet surrounded by its rings in a much more mutated form. I mean, put the moon Pan side by side with the planet Saturn, and you can see it. It's like a mutated version of Saturn. The spherical planet, the rings, it's got all those same features, just in a mutated form. But it's got that exact same formation to it. Now, remember again what they're saying. Pan is causing the Enki division. And remember, Pan is going to lead you back to Satan. And all of this stuff dealing with Satan and Saturn, the 3 sixes, the black sun, even the Sabbatic goat, the Baphomet, all of this stuff is going to always lead you back to the oppression of black people. And of course, we know race is not real. It's an illusion, a very strong illusion, but it is an illusion. And how do we get these quote unquote races? From mutations within the human DNA. We are all mutations of the original human beings. And quote unquote white people are nothing more than mutations of quote unquote black people. Remember, you've got that MC1R gene that produces eumelanin, or black and brown skin. And when that MC1R gene is blocked, you get pheomelanin, a mutation in the human genome that ultimately leads to white skin. And then look at that moon Pan again. It's like a mutation of Saturn. And this mutation of Saturn is creating the Enki division. And remember again, Enki in the mythology is the creator of human beings. So it's literally like they're saying Pan, or this mutation, is causing a division in the human race, black versus white, the divide of the races. And this whole thing is being driven by the energy of the god Pan, that satanic low vibrational energy. And when you look at the symbol of the goatfish, you can see that the goat is at the head and the fish is at the tail. So it's pretty much the same message. Pan is ruling Enki, or in other words, Satan is ruling humanity through division. And remember, with the theory of Yakub, you have that idea that this wasn't by accident, that this division was literally manufactured. And remember, with Enki, you've got those two separate creation stories, the black-headed people and mankind. And then you've got Norman Berggruen saying that the ring makers of Saturn are creating the Enki division and also the Cassini division. And when NASA sent that probe through the Cassini division, they figured out that it was the moon Mimas causing the division. Now, Mimas isn't even that close to the Cassini division. And it's another really small moon, just like Pan. But it has such a strong gravitational pull that it actually creates this gap from a distance. And remember, it's creating the largest gap in Saturn's rings. And Mimas is pretty popular because it looks just like the Death Star from Star Wars. But what's interesting is that Mimas was apparently not even discovered until 1980. And Star Wars was released in 1977. And so, you know, the official word is that it was just this coincidence that the Death Star just so happened to look a lot like this moon of Saturn, Mimas. But it's crazy. If you look at this moon and you look at the Death Star, the resemblance is undeniable. So if they didn't base the Death Star off of Mimas, then that's a pretty huge coincidence. And remember, in the original Star Wars, the Death Star is built by the Empire, which is led by Darth Vader. Now, remember, when Star Wars was originally released, it was released as a single film. It was a low budget movie, and there was no anticipation of this thing turning into what it became. And so that original story was supposed to be it. And remember, that original story was about this powerful Force user, Darth Vader, dressed in all black, leading an army of stormtroopers going from planet to planet, attempting to conquer each planet. And then when the second movie, The Emperor Strikes Back, came out and they introduced the snowtroopers, it's like they were just giving it to us in plain sight. Now, some of you might think I'm reaching with this one, and some of you might be seeing what I'm seeing. But I think the key is the Death Star. That links all of this back to Saturn, the ring makers, and everything else. Remember, again, Shani has that characteristic of testing you, literally creating obstacles and adversaries for you to work your way through and to continue to grow and to ascend. And now just think about that from the aspect of the ring makers creating divisions in Saturn's rings. And again, Mimas, aka the Death Star, is creating the largest division in Saturn's rings. The Cassini probe started detecting these radio emissions coming from Saturn all the way back in 2002. And at this point, the probe was still millions of miles away from the planet. But even being that far away, it was still able to detect these radio emissions. And again, they noticed that the radio waves were constantly changing, going higher and lower and transmitting at different speeds. And they found that the variations in the radio waves were actually being controlled by the vortexes on the northern and southern hemispheres of the planet. That each hemisphere was sending out different signals at different rates. And that each hemisphere has these auroras that extend out from these vortexes and emit these different radio waves. And eventually, when the Cassini probe moved in on Saturn for the final time in 2017, the probe got closer to the planet than it had ever been. And this is when they realized that those radio waves were actually moving between the planet Saturn and one of its moons, Enceladus. And these radio waves were literally moving in a circuit from the planet to the moon and from the moon to the planet, back and forth. And they realized that this circuit was actually a magnetic field, and that it was literally electromagnetic energy moving between Saturn and this moon. And Enceladus is another really small moon, not as small as Pan or Mimas, but still small enough for the entire moon to fit inside the United Kingdom. And almost every inch of the exterior of the moon is almost completely covered in ice. But on the inside of the moon is supposed to be this huge ocean. They say the moon is composed of about 91% water. And a good bit of this water, along with carbon, nitrogen, and methane, actually gushes out from this moon and actually orbits around Saturn. And they say that all these particles actually creates Saturn's E-ring, that once all of those particles orbit around the planet and spread out, it creates a band that forms the E-ring. And because Enceladus is constantly spewing out these particles, it's also constantly feeding the E-ring and maintaining that ring. And out of all of Saturn's rings, the E-ring sits the farthest out from the planet, and it kind of encircles all the rest of the rings and the planet. And it's actually the widest ring and the largest ring. So it's almost like a barricade surrounding the rest of the rings and the planet. And again, this E-ring, this final band or this final ring stretching out from Saturn, is being formed by the moon Enceladus, which is also constantly moving this electromagnetic energy back and forth between itself and the vortexes on Saturn's north and south poles. And again, when they compressed that electromagnetic energy and converted it into radio waves, they were able to hear what these emissions sounded like. And they literally described the sounds as eerie. And when you listen to what these radio emissions sound like, that's a pretty good description. They are bizarre. Now you got to understand that every celestial body in space is supposedly giving off some sort of sound, but there is nothing in space that sounds more unsettling than what is coming from Saturn. So needless to say, there's something really strange going on with these radio emissions. And remember, this is electromagnetic energy flowing from the planet Saturn to this moon and back, and being controlled and manipulated by these vortexes on the northern and southern hemispheres of the planet. It's almost like they're literally tuning this energy to different frequencies. And then that energy is flowing outward in a circuit. It's literally like a signal being transmitted. And here's what's crazy. If you look at the traditional symbol used for a radio signal with the antenna and the radio waves spreading out of the antenna, it looks a lot like Saturn and its rings. When you look at the main source of the antenna and those radio waves expanding from that source, it's basically like you're looking at Saturn from an overhead view, the planet and its rings, with the planet being the main source of that antenna and the planet's rings being those radio waves emitting from that antenna. And then you've got that tower elevating that antenna and helping to send those signals out into the atmosphere. And remember what they said about that vortex on Saturn, that it's possible that it could be towering above the clouds of Saturn. And they estimate it to be hundreds of kilometers tall, at least 190 miles high. So just think about that hexagon towering out from the planet and sending out those signals, or maintaining Saturn's rings. Remember, those vortexes are linked to the moon Enceladus, which is maintaining that E-ring. And remember that E-ring surrounds all the rest of the rings and the planet. And it's also continuously being sent that electromagnetic energy from these vortexes. That's a lot of energy. And where is it going? Possibly to the rings, but is it going anywhere else? Well, remember, the E-ring is the farthest ring from the planet. And so you got to wonder, is that energy or those signals being transmitted somewhere else? Remember, whenever you see Saturn in astrology or even dealing with the god Shani, Saturn is always connected to the earth. Whenever you're dealing with Saturn, you're also always dealing with the earth. Now, remember, the moon Mimas is causing the largest division in Saturn's rings. And the thing about Mimas is that they believe that there might actually be an ocean inside the core of that moon. And the reason why is because of the way that it orbits Saturn, because it has one of the weirdest orbits of any moon. It orbits Saturn through a rocking motion called libration. So when it orbits, it literally looks like it's rocking back and forth. And they describe it as being similar to the way that a pendulum swings. And they say that this moon is tidally locked to the planet Saturn. So it's permanently facing the planet as it orbits around the planet in that rocking motion, like a pendulum. Now, remember, for a long time, pendulums were used inside clocks. The pendulum would hang at the end of the clock and swing back and forth. And as that pendulum swung back and forth, it would swing from left to right over and over. And each time it would go from left to right or right to left in the exact same amount of time with every swing. And that pendulum was used to help that clock stay in perfect time. And you pretty much see the same concept with the metronome. You know, that little device that musicians used to use when they were practicing music. It's got that pendulum on it that rocks back and forth in perfect intervals to help musicians keep time while they play. And again, you've got the moon, Mimas, rocking back and forth like a pendulum as it orbits Saturn. And again, has such a strong gravitational pull that it creates the largest division in Saturn's rings. And here's the thing, a full orbit for Mimas takes 23 hours. So basically 1 day on Mimas would equal out to 23 hours. And of course, 1 day on Earth is 24 hours, or at least that's what we've been told anyway. But in actuality, 1 Earth day is only 23 hours. It only takes 23 hours for the Earth to make a full rotation. So we've got the Earth making a full rotation every 23 hours. And we've got this moon, Mimas, swinging like a pendulum while orbiting Saturn every 23 hours and creating the largest gap in Saturn's rings, as Saturn sends out and receives back these electromagnetic radio emissions. So as crazy as it sounds, it's almost like we have time itself being broadcast from Saturn. Remember, in the Greek mythology, Kronos was the god of time. And even in magic, the energies of Saturn are going to lead you back to time. And remember, the goddess Kali, or she who is black, having that attribute of time. And all of this is starting with those vortexes on Saturn.